1935, the largest aircraft yet built in America lifted itself from the waters of San Francisco Bay. Ahead lay the longest leg of a 5-day journey across the Pacific Ocean. The Great China Clipper, flagship of Pan American Airways. Her famous flight to the exotic Far East would immortalize the age of the great flying boats. In the 1930s, Pan Am's Clipper flying boats established the world's first air service across 2 oceans and offered travelers the ultimate in modern transportation. Before their demise nearly 50 years ago, the Great Clippers captured the imagination of the American public and triggered a passion for flying boats that still flourishes today. All of Pan American Airways' giant flying boats are gone. But today, in San Francisco, vivid memories remain.
You know, you'd see them taking off, you'd see them going through the gate. The newspapers were full of stories.
To those who remember, the China Clipper was a technological wonder with a mystique unlike any other aircraft. Yet, she was just one of Pan Am's Clipper fleet, the great flying boats that crossed oceans and captivated the many who watched.
Well, a seaplane is a very beautiful thing to watch. And then being a seacoast port like San Francisco, we loved ocean-going craft anyway, and this magnificent challenge that Pan American was way ahead of their time, really.
It was quite a big deal to take a trip on Pan Am because you were really going someplace.
So it was easily to try to fall in love with something like that, and we did, and it was just an era, the proper time, and everything fell into place at that time.
It was a time when the romance of the high seas blended with the science of aeronautics. An irresistible combination that would compel 2 young men to become Clipper pilots. Dan Mulholland and Wally Dean, over 30 years of service with Pan American Airways. Of all the aircraft they flew throughout their careers, the Clipper flying boats were their favorite. Today, they're taking a special flight back to San Francisco Bay, where they began their glamorous career as Clipper pilots. This Grumman Albatross is but a shadow of the giant Clippers, but as an amphibian flying boat, it will bring back the thrill of landing in the waters of San Francisco Bay. An experience that had beckoned Dan and Wally to fly Clippers years ago.
Being a native of San Francisco, I would see the flying Clippers going out through the gate. I'd watch their takeoffs in the bay. And it was hard being a college and high school student and not wanting to emulate those men that were doing that at that time.
I was born and raised practically on an airport all the time, so I was really intrigued with the big boats. Only an elite group of people would fly on Pan Am.
Elite because only Pan Am's flying boats had established regular air service across the 2 largest oceans. Why the flying boat? Very few airstrips in the 1930s were large enough to support giant aircraft capable of crossing oceans with heavy payloads. Water offered an unlimited runway, able to sustain the largest of aircraft and lend the distance necessary to attain takeoff speeds. With the designs of some of the greatest aircraft builders in the country, Pan American produced a fleet of flying boats which were second to none. With Harvey Denton, an old Pan Am colleague at the controls, Dan Mulholland and Wally Dean are in for one last flying boat tour into San Francisco Bay. A short odyssey back 60 years to the glory days of the flying boat. A saga that begins not in this country, but in Europe. November 2nd, 1930. The shape of things to come. A monster of the airways makes its impressive takeoff from Friedrichshafen, Germany. 12 Bristol Jupiter engines of 525 horsepower each just barely lift her from the water runway. With a wingspan of over 157 feet and a maximum weight of over 114,000 pounds, Dr. Claude Dornier's DOX flying boat is the largest aircraft the world has ever seen. With an all-metal hull and long, slender fuselage, this is a ship with wings. The pilot's cabin, too, like a captain's bridge, echoes the character of an ocean liner. Precisely Dr. Dornier's intention, an ocean liner of the air, the pioneer of a transatlantic airline. The flight crew manipulates numerous levers, nurturing engine speeds for the long haul across the Atlantic. For shorter flights, passengers can enjoy luxurious accommodations. 3 decks are divided into cabins able to seat 66 passengers. Dining rooms, sleeping quarters, even a central saloon stretches 23 feet with a plush bar. Pleasure and comfort, elementary as range and payload to the aircraft's design. August 27th, 1931. The DOX arrives in New York Harbor, the final stop on a grand tour of Europe and the Americas. Despite the enthusiastic reception, however, the 10-month journey through 3 continents has unfortunately revealed more shortcomings than anticipated. Numerous delays, minor mishaps, and general bad luck has tarnished Dr. Dornier's silver waterbird. With financial backers dwindling, the DOX would return to Berlin, never to cross an ocean again. Nevertheless, an irreversible step toward transoceanic air travel had been taken. Surely one man must have paid especially close attention. 4 months prior to the DOX landing in New York, Juan Trippe had consolidated his position as president of Pan American Airways, the vehicle that would deliver him his dream of creating the greatest American overseas airline. The ambitious Trippe had succeeded in courting the well-off and the well-connected to secure lucrative government contracts for foreign airmail service. Master of the deal, Trippe had stormed through the Caribbean, swooping up foreign airmail routes and devastating unstable competitors. His dreams were becoming reality at a breakneck pace. Juan Terry Trippe detested his given name that honored his mother's favorite aunt, Juanita. Soon he would be called the man who shrank the earth, a distinction he much preferred. If not his business daring, it was Trippe's imagination that would enable the Pan American Empire to girdle the globe. Affluent friends had been essential, but Trippe needed to capture the passion of aviation itself. What better ally than a young pilot from St. Louis who symbolized the romance of aviation around the world? Charles Lindbergh would become Pan Am's technical advisor less than 2 years after his solo flight across the Atlantic. Trippe could not have tagged a more glamorous figure to blaze Pan Am's international trails. A partnership that would provide millions of dollars in publicity for Pan Am. Lindbergh was also one of the few pilots with the skills to pioneer new airline routes. In turn, he would reinforce his love of flying and a devotion to the future of international aviation. The best pilot in hand, Trippe now needed the best plane to extend his reach into remote parts of Central and South America, areas sorely lacking roads, railways, and airport facilities. He turned to Igor Sikorsky, a Russian emigre who not 10 years before had fled the Bolshevik Revolution, leaving behind a brilliant career in aviation. Sikorsky had since been trying to reclaim the success he once enjoyed back in Russia. The S-38 amphibian flying boat would now save his struggling company and offer Pan Am the ideal workhorse to expand its empire. Tripp could now build cheap bases down empty coastlines and up remote rivers. As one engineer astutely pointed out, the S-38 carries its own airport on its bottom. The peculiar-looking boat would serve well and earn the respect of many of Pan Am's pilots, including Lindbergh. The virtues of aircraft that can land free of an airstrip were obvious in Tripp's mind. By 1931, Tripp had built a 20,308-mile empire spanning 20 countries throughout Central and South America, the world's largest airline in terms of route miles. Once Pan Am had secured Latin America, Tripp was ready to set his sights on overseas routes to Europe and the means to cover them. Soon, some of the greatest aircraft designers in the country would offer Tripp the type of aircraft he needed to build the world's first transatlantic air service. In the meantime, one of his latest acquisitions, the Consolidated Commodore, introduced something new to commercial air travel. This twin-engine flying boat was elegant, signaling an evolution in passenger service that would forever change Pan Am's public image. Air travel was becoming as comfortable as it was exciting, only the beginning of America's long love affair with the flying boat. September 18th, 1931. The shape of things to come. Thousands of miles across the Pacific Ocean, an island nation has staged an international incident on the Asian mainland. A military provocation. Just the excuse needed to justify invading China's northern territory. Within 4 days, the Japanese army seizes control of southern Manchuria. The seeds of World War II were already being sown. East Asia would suffer 10 years of Japanese aggression before the United States would finally feel its sting. While a few had appreciated the implications of war in 1931, most of America pictured the Far East as an exotic and mysterious world that lay far across the Pacific Ocean. And none could imagine that within 6 years, Pan Am would bring America to Asia's doorstep. In 1931, however, Juan Tripp's eye was still on Europe. When the German DOX landed in New York Harbor that summer, it was clear that the race to build a transatlantic airliner had already begun. Crossing oceans is quite different from island hopping through the Caribbean. Pan Am's next aircraft would have to meet two requirements: greater range and payload, carry enough fuel for the haul across the Atlantic, and haul enough cargo to cover the cost of operation. A giant 4-engine flying boat promised sufficient range, carrying ability, and best of all, the capacity to land on water. In 1934, Igor Sikorsky designed just such an aircraft, the S-42, first of Pan American's great clippers. In the final test flight at the Sikorsky facility on Long Island Sound, the S-42 broke 8 world records for weight carrying. Sikorsky had achieved the optimum balance between payload and range. Unlike Dornier's monstrous DOX, Pan Am's new transoceanic flying boat could carry a payload large enough for commercial success. Lindbergh was thrilled, and his boss, Juan Trippe, finally possessed an aircraft capable of crossing the Atlantic. But it looked as though he did not have an ocean to cross. There was no way an aircraft the size of the S-42 could fly the Atlantic non-stop. Island stepping stones were needed for service and refueling. Great Britain's Imperial Airways, Pan Am's chief competitor, denied Pan Am landing rights to one of the crucial stopover points, Newfoundland. London put pressure on its former colony to keep Trippe out. Built by the Short brothers, Imperial C-class flying boats were unable to compete with the S-42's range and performance. They did maintain, however, a vital link between England and her overseas holdings. The British could not afford to let Pan Am muscle in on their lifeline to the Empire. Until her Empire flying boats could match Pan Am's transatlantic capabilities, Britain would not give Trippe the stepping stone he needed to cross the Atlantic. An agreement would not be reached until 1936. By that time, Trippe had already found another ocean to cross, and America its own empire. But before Pan Am would conquer the Pacific Ocean, its clipper service to Latin America became a hit with the American public, generating a passion for flying boats that today has outlasted the clippers themselves. A passion that will soon rejuvenate this aircraft. This white giant is a direct descendant of Imperial Airways C-class flying boats. Built by the Short brothers, this Solent is the final expression of Britain's great flying boats and one of the last in existence. Unlike Pan Am's clippers, it has avoided the scrap heap. It now rests out of its element, adjacent to Oakland Airport, where less elegant land planes buzz overhead. Soon, however, it will be restored to all its glory by Rick Grant, a man who has been in love with flying boats all his life.
As a young boy, I saw large Navy flying boats down in Key West, Florida, and that sort of gave me the initial spark for my interest in flying boats. And later on, I saw them while in school down on the Virgin Islands, and it occurred to me it would be the perfect mode of transportation to get around the ocean for my ocean science concept. We had envisioned an ocean science program using seaplanes, and still have that vision, but not so much for this aircraft. The evolution now is into a sort of a passenger travel idea. This big flying boat is just such a classic that it's hard to resist any other idea to put it into a passenger mode of transportation.
In a few years, his Solent will offer the unique experience of flying boat travel. Island hopping through the Pacific, Rick Grant will lead travel excursions unlike any other. An experience that Pan Am had offered to its passengers over 60 years ago. The S-42 enters Pan American service in 1934. Although transatlantic service has temporarily eluded him, Juan Trippe brings a new standard of air travel to South America. Before the passengers board, as always, valuable cargo space is loaded with airmail, still a very lucrative operation for Pan Am.
That's one of the key aspects of any early aviation, was the mail contracts, which were handed out very exclusively to airlines, often placing bids, or sometimes I think maybe given them for their inside connections, but that helped subsidize the early startup costs.
However, Trippe downplays the mail service. publicity focuses on passenger service. Pan Am travel is to be an adventure for those few who can afford the experience.
Mostly governmental officials, business people, and very wealthy individuals were doing this kind of travel. There were only a handful of these special aircraft serving areas into South America, so it wasn't for mass travel. Mass travel in aircraft only really began in the late 50s and in the early 60s.
Nevertheless, many dreamed of leaving their troubles behind while they zipped down to Rio, touching down on some exotic lagoon. Even Hollywood would immortalize the South American Clipper service in the musical film Flying Down to Rio, starring Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers. Rick Grant plans to bring back a piece of that era. With his flying boat, he will offer a travel adventure few can resist.
This project is very exciting, and we believe it'll go forward because of the tremendous interest in nostalgia and people's interest in experiencing new things. It harkens back to a golden age of aviation. It takes you back to a stylish period where Ginger Rogers and Fred Astaire and all of the fascinating architecture and that kind of thing were the rage, and people are trying to escape the kind of standardization. They want to experience new things, go to new places, and visit these kind of locations in a way they've never done before.
While he cannot duplicate Pan Am's Clippers, Rick Grant hopes his Solent will recapture the glamour.
Boarding this plane takes you back in time. Passengers taking off for exotic locations had a wonderful experience. They had great views of tropical islands passing before them, and then they would magically touch down on the water and experience that location in an unusual way as compared to with today's form of air travel.
It's easy to imagine what Pan Am had offered its overseas travelers, luxury that only an ocean liner could match. For one trip, it was the only way to fly. Service was first class all the way, catering to the most discriminating palate. Style and comfort were carried throughout the entire aircraft. Trip had created elegance in the skies, gliding over Caribbean waters that passed below. Cruising 150 miles per hour, the S-42 was run like an ocean liner. Nautical terms were applied to the crew: captain, first officer, radio officer, and to the ship, port, starboard, beam. "32 passengers sat in 4 compartments, each holding 8 comfortable upholstered seats with adjustable headrests. Draperies adjusted over each window. The 50-foot aisle was spacious and carpeted in dark green, while the walls were lined with walnut paneling. Served on china, wine glasses, linen napkins, and white tablecloths. Gourmet meals were presented in serving dishes by white jacketed waiters, certainly a novelty by today's standards. Later, maybe a smoke, some reading, or a game of cards. And before you know it, the steward announces your arrival. A glance out the window, and magically, a dream lies below. Havana, Rio, Buenos Aires, or some island paradise, all in no time at all, compared to travel by steamship. Eventually, Pan Am would offer service from New York to Bermuda in just 5 hours, advertising Bermuda by Air, your weekend getaway. Finally, the icing on the cake, a gentle touchdown on clear blue tropical water. It was easy to fall in love with Pan Am's great flying boats, called Clippers, in tribute to the swift commercial vessels of a bygone era. A tradition that would become a registered Pan Am trademark and a national obsession. The age of the great Clippers would tickle the national psyche, fueling the imagination and ambition of 2 young pilots over 50 years ago.
We're at your 6-7 and good clearance. You got us now.
As in the case of Dan Mulholland and Wally Dean.
And I think that best altitude will be...
Today, their passion for flying boats carries them toward a 50-year reunion with the waters of San Francisco Bay.
I'd say, Wally, head for the...
Taking the controls from pilot Harvey Denton, Wally Dean enjoys the familiar feel of setting a course for San Francisco. Below lies the vast Pacific Ocean. Over 60 years ago, it was filled with many unknowns for aviation. Before Pan Am could attempt a crossing, a Pacific air track had to be developed.
Wally, you fly this thing better than I do.
Once again, Lucky Lindy comes to Juan Tripp's aid, this time in company with his wife Anne. As early as 1931, Tripp's vision of the greatest overseas airline had included routes across the Pacific. Wasting no time, he sent the Lindberghs out in a Lockheed Cirrus, a seaplane with a range of 2,000 miles, to conduct an aerial survey of a great circle route from Alaska through the Aleutian Islands to Siberia, down to Japan and on to China. Again, the lack of facilities underscored the virtue of an aircraft that can operate off of water. Enthusiastic receptions met the Lindberghs every step of the way. Perhaps only a few sensed the irony in the hearty Japanese welcome given the 2 Americans. Relations between the 2 countries were already deteriorating, to the point that the U.S. State Department discouraged Tripp from pursuing the North Pacific route. 4 years later, however, he would find another way. By 1935, the relationship between Pan Am and the United States government could not be closer. In the spring of that year, a 15,000-ton steamer drops anchor off the coast of a small atoll, barely 2 sandy strips of land, one of many between Hawaii and the Philippines. Midway Island will never be the same. The North Haven unloads its cargo, the equivalent of 2 complete air bases. Radio towers, barrels of fuel, diesel engines, launches, water storage units, lumber, 10-ton electric generators, and 10-ton tractors are all ferried ashore. Over 100 technicians, engineers, construction workers, and cooks begin their arduous task of what would be called the most spectacular move in airline history. Clipper bases, stepping stones between Hawaii and the Philippines. When the Midway facility is complete, the North Haven will sail for Wake Island, an even more desolate piece of coral. But nevertheless, she is, like Midway, a U.S. protectorate. If Juan Trippe could not reach Europe by way of the Atlantic Ocean, he would take the long way, westward across the Pacific Ocean. When Trippe had approached the government for the foreign airmail contract, the Secretary of the Navy saw an opportunity of epic proportions. Trippe would be permitted to build Clipper bases at Midway and Wake, and use existing marine terminals at Guam and Manila. In return, American outposts across the Central Pacific, keeping a watchful eye on Japanese encroachment while avoiding an overly provocative military presence. America was taming her last frontier, which Juan Trippe was eager to pioneer with the biggest aircraft yet. Thousands of miles back east, in Middle River, Maryland, a giant is about to awaken. The Glenn L. Martin Company will soon deliver its transoceanic Clipper to Pan Am. Martin's friends and associates had warned it was a foolish gamble. Trippe had asked Martin to produce an aircraft that could cruise at 150 miles per hour and carry 52 passengers non-stop for more than 3,200 miles. For Martin himself, it will be his masterpiece. For the American public, a spiritual lift from economic depression. And for Juan Trippe, more of the same: prestige, profits, and fame. When the M130 came out of the factory, it was destined to conquer the Pacific. In 1935, it was the largest aircraft ever constructed in America. Her wings spanned 130 feet, and remarkably, she could carry over 52,000 pounds, twice her structural weight. On November 22, 1935, the great China Clipper was ready to make history. It was to be a new era, hailed the many speakers there at the edge of San Francisco Bay. Captain Ed Musick, the reticent Pan Am pilot, had been a reluctant hero. He detested the unyielding publicity stunts that Juan Trippe so eagerly embraced. This one was the biggest of them all, the inauguration of the first scheduled airmail service to cross the Pacific. To the thousands crowded around the docks of Alameda and the millions glued to their radios, the great China Clipper symbolized the American dream. Hard work, vision, and good old American know-how had taken the country to the forefront of technological achievement. Hard work indeed. Gladly leaving the crowds behind, Musick and his crew prepared themselves for the non-stop flight across the widest part of the widest ocean. An awesome voyage that many thought had been too hastily scheduled. Not 7 months before, Musick had made the first proving flight from Alameda to Honolulu in a stripped-down S-42, her cargo laden with precious fuel. Only a handful of flights followed, pioneering the Central Pacific routes before the hopes of Pan Am and the nation rested with the crew of the China Clipper.
The flying boat captains in the 30s and into the 40s were really quite exceptional men. They weren't just aviators, they also had to master a wide range of skills and technology. In the case of Pan Am, they started them out learning everything from the basics of Morse code to the construction and engineering of the aircraft, all the way to, of course, all your nautical seafaring techniques. So these gentlemen were probably the equivalent of today's astronauts. They were their computers were between their ears. They had to calculate things that today a conventional land plane pilot just doesn't have to deal with.
An old flyer's tale warned that straying aircraft could be sucked into an immense vortex off the coast of California. Hogwash to the crew, but in reality, Pacific meteorology was practically non-existent. Nevertheless, navigator Fred Noonan was able to secure celestial fixes with his sextant in the same way that seafarers had been guiding their vessels for centuries. Out of the clouds, the crew recognized Diamond Head. Below, Honolulu. 10:10 a.m. 20 hours and 33 minutes after their takeoff from San Francisco Bay, Ed Musick lands the China Clipper in Pearl Harbor. 2,400 miles of ocean, the first and longest leg of the 8,200-mile trek to Manila, had been crossed. The fanfare and receptions were inescapable. Midway, Wake, Guam, and finally Manila were reached successfully, each base trying to outdo the other in celebration. The first official airmail service across the Pacific had been completed on November 29th. When the press hounded Captain Musick for a description of this historic flight, he replied in his characteristically laconic way, "Without incident." For commercial aviation, the flight of the China Clipper was a technological triumph without precedent.
Pan Am was really represented the cutting edge of this country, the best, technology. And in the early 30s, of course, with the Depression on, the lifting of the spirits to think that we could still conquer, frontiers like that was very exciting for the general public. So they followed the flights on the edge of their seats.
Nearly 1 year following the China Clipper's inaugural mail flight, passenger service to the Orient began on the Hawaii Clipper, second of 3 Martin 130s delivered to Pan Am. The M130 was not as elegant as the S-42, but the interior was certainly spacious enough. Although originally designed to carry 32 passengers, the M130 utilized much of its spacious interior to haul fuel needed for the long stretch to Hawaii. Even with her mighty engines, she would not pull much of a payload. In 3 years, the grandest flying boat ever produced would solve all these problems. But until then, the M130 carried mail and dignitaries to cover the expense of regular service to the Orient. Package or passenger, the cargo did not matter to those who watched the Clippers in San Francisco Bay. The technological wonder of shrinking time and space between two worlds was enchanting in its own right.
It's gonna work out fine. Now I'm rolling wings.
So much so that Dan Mulholland and Wally Dean had dreamed of the day they would sit in the cockpit of a great Clipper.
Straight through between the uprights, obviously at altitude. We used to go over by the pilots.
Today, in the cockpit of this Albatross, they're making their final approach to where it all began.
About 17 and a half knots, it looks like. Piece of cake, piece of cake. Piece of cake.
When they finally earned their wings with Pan Am in the early 1940s, the dream of flying over the Golden Gate Bridge became a reality.
Turn it right.
The last time was over 50 years ago, until today. A smaller plane, a few years in between, but still the same path they'd piloted hundreds of flights before. Ahead, Treasure Island and a landing in Clipper Cove, the last built Pan Am Clipper base built in San Francisco.
And then they moved up, got Treasure Island fixed and moved up here, and they used this area where we're going to land
out here. They marked the seaway and also the landing conditions for it. Harvey, that Berkeley Pier makes a good downwind heading and track for you.
Thank you very much, Dan.
Yeah, I'm right here with taxi in, and the big hangars were here. They had docks, about 5 or 6 docks all along this side right here.
Got a sailboat. We know where our wind is.
Yep, wind's almost due west.
Okay, everybody listen up. This is a water landing. We are leaving the landing gear up, unlike the Clippers that didn't have the choice. Okay, Phil, why don't you run us a before landing check, right up to the boost pumps and the mixtures.
Okay.
1 notch.
Harvey, that was beautiful.
Ain't over yet.
That tail just wants the weather vane like crazy.
Wally, this is where we used to put the extra crew members out on the wing to keep the wing down.
When do we start swimming?
That's the old line boat trick. Never land further from land than you're willing to swim.
Every flying boat landing is different, but always the same. Never the same runway, but always a different thrill.
Today was the first landing I've had in a seaplane in 51 years. And I wish I could say my landing was quite as smooth as the one that was made today. Conditions identical, weather very similar.
Operating off rough waters can often be dangerous, but by 1938, the sturdy Clippers and their crews were facing dangers of a different sort. When the Hawaii Clipper disappeared without a trace over the South Pacific that year, some had suspected foul play, the tragic consequence of Japanese intolerance toward an increasing American presence in the Far East. Most had claimed foul weather. Undeniably, storms of some kind were brewing over the Pacific Ocean.
I hereby dedicate the World's Fair, the New York World's Fair of 1939, and I declare it open to all mankind.
They came from everywhere to see everything American progress had to offer. DuPont introduced nylons. General Motors revealed the world of tomorrow. And roaring over the crowds, Pan Am introduced, finally, its first scheduled airmail service across the Atlantic. The honors were carried out by Tripp's newest and greatest clipper, the Boeing 314. The Yankee Clipper had left Port Washington, New York, May 20th, 1939, stopped at Lisbon via the Azores, and cruised into Marseille with over 1,800 pounds of letters. The B-314 was truly a monster. She was the largest commercial plane to fly until the debut of the jumbo jet, 30 years later. Her gross takeoff weight was an incredible 82,000 pounds. A beautiful aircraft that a young teenager would love to get his hands on.
Hey, was up here at the World's Fair in 1939 in the high school band. And one of the main attractions here was to go through the Pan Am base right here, the big hangar right over here that had the Boeing 314 in the hangar, and they had a big catwalk up over the top of the airplane, so you could stand up on top and the public could see the airplanes. The mechanics working on the airplane, and I at that time thought, boy, if I could just get down and touch that airplane, it'd really be exciting. Well, 4 years later, I have my commercial license and instructor's rating and so forth, and I ended up being with Pan Am and got to fly on the airplane.
By the end of June 1939, the Dixie Clipper inaugurated the first regular scheduled passenger service across the North Atlantic, the culmination of Juan Tripp's 10-year drive to establish a transatlantic service. Precious cargo could be flown across the seas in a matter of hours rather than days. Compared to the Martin Clippers, the B-314s could deliver 30% more cargo with a range of up to 3,500 miles. As for luxury, Pan Am had outdone itself. Everything was first class. A 14-seat dining lounge with formal place settings, linens, flowers, and of course the best French wines and champagne. Even a captain's table on some flights. The passenger deck could seat up to 74 people. Pullman-like sleeping berths were available for overnight flights. Top it off with a deluxe bridal suite, and the effect was hypnotic.
Being a young man growing up in San Francisco and traveling over the bridge and watching the Clippers take off and going out through the Golden Gate and reading about them and watching all these things going on around me, it was very difficult not to become entranced with flying boats and Pan American and the exploration of the Pacific Ocean in those days.
Pan Am's Clippers offered the perfect match: modern technology with old-world adventure. Honolulu and beyond promised an undreamed-of paradise, a limitless expanse that the Clippers managed to cross in no time at all. A kind of time travel to the old world, the exotic Far East that had obsessed Western explorers centuries before. With a network spanning the two largest oceans, Pan Am had seemed to bring the world closer together, while the seeds of war threatened to tear it apart. And yet, underneath the charm, America was fulfilling a kind of manifest destiny for the 20th century. The luxurious resorts on these island stepping stones to the Orient were as linked to national security as they were to passenger comfort. They were outposts protecting U.S. sovereignty across the Pacific frontier. Like the powerful locomotives that had crisscrossed the Wild West, Pan Am's Clippers sustained America's lifeline to her Pacific holdings. Tiny patches of the United States dotting the globe like signposts, bearing names that would carry such a different significance in the short years to come. It all seems so perfectly evident in hindsight of over 50 years, but for most, the great clash over the Pacific was still unimagined.
Well, the Pacific was a relatively unknown region to most of us in those times, and then to see these beautiful flying boats taking off and going into these remote places of the world, and the beauty of it was one thing, the adventure of it was another, and it was just a logical extension of our knowledge and our desire to have adventure, and we fell into the pattern of wanting to do these things, and that's how I was drawn to the seaplanes and to Pan American.
Barely 3 months after Pan Am's B-314 inaugurated transatlantic service, the old world in Europe gave in to the insurmountable pressures of war. As Nazi Germany sought its own breathing room across the continent, passenger service to Europe dropped drastically. The only lifeline between the U.S. and Europe would connect to Lisbon in neutral Portugal. England, by 1941, stood alone against Hitler's Luftwaffe. That same year saw the inevitable. The American giant, rudely awoken from its isolationist sleep, began mustering its strength that would eventually crush two rapacious powers on both sides of the globe. The U.S. government now reaped the rewards of its close relationship with Pan American. All the M130s and B314s would go into service for the U.S. war machine. When Dan and Wally finally got their chance to fly the Great Clippers, they were taking off for war. They would lead missions for which the Clippers were ideally suited. Massive cargo and troop transport across both oceans. They were leaving behind a golden age, which later years of commercial aviation would never quite equal. The Great Clippers never made it past the 1940s. The logistic demands of war produced land planes that would eventually surpass the range, payload, and speed of flying boats. The elegance, the adventure, the mystique of the Great Clippers would be lost. But not in spirit. The romance is still alive. It echoes in the dreamers like Rick Grant, who envision a renaissance of flying boat adventures. And today, for two pilots reliving their glory days, the dream is eternal. As Dan and Wally headed off to war, they probably did not hear the slow death knell behind the roar of engines and the crash of ocean spray that would ring out the inevitable demise of the flying boat.